Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. The Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people on the excuse of 9/11, but the U.S. hasn't achieved that control. But they haven't stopped trying for it, or stopped killing people. President Obama is conducting a worldwide program of assassinations that has rightly been called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. Most Americans don't know that our president has killed more than 6,000 people with drones alone, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. According to the New York Times, Obama himself chooses the targets. And the Obama administration has begun the 15th year of U.S. attacks on Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history. It's been 6 years since President Obama's 2009 surge. He sent tens of thousands more U.S. troops to Afghanistan as soon as he was in office. Today, there remain close to 10,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, while the Obama administration quietly admits they will keep them there for years. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." The attacks in Paris this month and other attacks ascribed to ISIS around the world are being used like 9/11 as justification for more attacks by the U.S. and its NATO clients throughout the Mideast. Because war is good for business, for some. We Americans should be concerned with how the government, which supposedly represents us, uses terrorism as an excuse to enhance the profits of the very rich, the 1%. And it's working. 95% of income gains during the Obama administration have gone to the 1%, while wages have continued to be flat or declining for most Americans. Median family income has continued to decline in the Obama years. Only a few American politicians on the right and left fringes of the Republican and Democratic parties are actually opposed to the Obama administration's killing of people abroad, or even at home, through our militarized police forces, who kill far more people than in other developed countries. Jill Stein of the Green Party writes, quote, "We have created ISIS by invading the Mideast, and the thinking is that we can fix ISIS by doing more of what created ISIS," close quote. Retired Congressman Ron Paul writes we should, quote, "reject regime change, stop shipping weapons, no more bombs, and robust defense at home." In their book on the last presidential election campaign, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann quote President Obama as saying, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. The remark hasn't been denied by the White House, and however ironically he said it, it turns out to be true. It's time to reverse Obama's killing policy, not intensify it as the leading Republican and Democrat presidential candidates say. We should demand instead the closing of U.S. military bases in foreign countries. There are literally 1,000 of them. No other country has more than 12. Bringing U.S. troops and mercs home. And 3, cutting the Pentagon budget in half and using the resultant force to defend U.S. territory against killers foreign and domestic, notably the local police, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. But instead, as the noted reporter Seymour Hersh wrote, high-level lying remains the modus operandi of U.S. policy in the Obama administration, along with secret prisons, drone attacks, special forces night raids, bypassing the chain of command, and cutting out those who might say no. Our job tonight is to give a more honest account of the Obama administration's criminal war policy in the current circumstances, notably ongoing war in the Mideast. Our focus is on our country's war policy, As Noam Chomsky said long ago, I think what we ought to do is to try to understand the truth about the world. And the truth about the world is usually quite unpleasant. My own concern is primarily the terror and violence carried out by my own country, for two reasons. For one thing, because it happens to be the largest component of international violence, but also for a much more important reason than that. Namely, I can do something about it. So even if the U.S. was responsible for 2% of the violence in the world, instead of the majority of it, it would be that 2% I would be primarily responsible for. And that is a simple ethical judgment. That is, the ethical value of one's actions depends on their anticipated and predictable consequences. It is very easy to denounce the atrocities of someone else. That has about as much ethical value as denouncing atrocities that took place in the 18th century. Close quote. So we will talk about our own country's atrocities tonight, and we may include some comments about the significance for U.S. war policy of the shooting down of a Russian plane by our NATO client, Turkey. But we'll begin with Ron Zook.
Yes, I want to, make a stupid chemistry joke at first. This will be some acid on bases, and
oh dear.
Talk a bit about current and pending hotspots around the world. In Ukraine and Crimea, a couple of power pylons were bombed, apparently, and taking out the electricity that was going to the Crimean Peninsula. So the Russians are talking about retaliating by keeping gas and oil from Ukraine as they're heading into the winter. So that's looking worse and worse. Each side wants to keep raising the ante in their conflict, and it's a classic case of escalation of the hostilities, in which it's not doing either side any good. In the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and now Turkey, which is a NATO member, as was mentioned, they shot down a Russian plane in the past day or so, and Putin is making some ominous noises about that. And why is Turkey doing this and provoking Russia? It's hard to understand unless there's some tendency off stage to get the Turks to engage in a conflict with Russia, and we will officially not be a part of it, but of course we'll have provoked it and supported it. Third hotspot in the South China Sea, another imperial war seems to be looming there on the periphery, requiring more and more billions of dollars, more men, more money and support. And I'll come back to that. Forthcoming hotspots, the lily pads, the stations that are spread across Central Africa, and we've already been bloodied there in Mogadishu and so on, but it doesn't stop us. We have to show that we are the masters of the world. So here's the picture, if you can see any of this. I want to talk about three places in particular. Okinawa, which is right south of Japan here. There's an American base there, but enormous conflict about what has happened with the American troops there in particular. The pattern that always seems to emerge is an enormous American base in the as a sequel to World War II. There are hundreds or thousands of American troops stationed there, and the upper class likes it because the U.S. is paying an enormous rental, in effect, to keep their base there. But it will result in some rapes and murders of local women which has happened over and over again. And so there'll be a lot of popular unrest and conflict about that. And so they're wanting to move the base in Okinawa, but there's a popular movement there for it to be removed entirely. So that's Japan. Next, Diego Garcia, which is way down here in the middle of the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from anything apparently, but which is now used by the USA as a heavy bomber base primarily for bombing anywhere in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the like. There's a long story there, a recent book by David Vine called Island of Shame about what was done to the native inhabitants of Diego Garcia. It was originally, well, not originally, but more recently in the 19th century, a British outpost. Then the Brits were somehow persuaded to turn it over to the Americans, and now all of the native Chagosians, the indigenous people there, have been moved thousands of miles away, and they're living in dire poverty. David Vine, the author of this book, Island of Shame, is an anthropologist at American University in Washington, D.C., I believe. And his assignment was to find out something about these native people who were expelled from the Chagos archipelago over to several other places around the rim of the Indian Ocean. And his previous book then, prior to the one I'm going to mention, was about what happened to those people. And the title of it again is Island of Shame, about the people of Diego Garcia. And finally, what's happening now is the rebuilding and reactivation of the Subic Bay Naval Base. Since the Spanish-American War of 1898, essentially from about 1901 to about 1991, there was an American base here in the Philippines at Subic Bay, which is one of the few deepwater ports in the area. And it's about 62 miles, 100 kilometers northwest of Manila on the big island of Luzon. And the strategic advantage of it is that it faces out open to the South China Sea. And that's where the current conflict then is going to erupt. Here's the South China Sea. Here is Subic Bay Naval Base. Here are the Spratlys and the Paracel Islands that the Chinese are expanding. And the USA is telling them, you can't do that, and we're going to challenge you every step of the way. And so that's where another conflict is going to erupt, it seems. Subic Bay has the same problem as Okinawa. Huge base there, covering many square miles. These bases are larger than most people can possibly imagine. They have thousands of soldiers there. And of course, just outside the main gate, there is the Camp Town, it's called. The red light district, all of the prostitutes, the drugs, gambling stations, and so on. And again, there have been a couple of murders there, and conflict is erupting. There are a number of the Philippine people who say, we don't want them here, we want them out. And, but the rebuilding and rearming of Subic Bay is going on anyway, because the Americans apparently have signed a 15-year lease for this area, which after the Americans were expelled in about 1991-92, was what's called a free port, just a commercial port primarily at Subic Bay. But now it's being rearmed, and it's apparently considered a terrific naval base and hundreds of miles closer to the South China Sea than any other base that we will have. It's right next door to the Clark Air Force Base, which was operated for years and then abandoned after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, I think it was. It became unusable after that. Everything was coated with ash and so on, and pretty largely destroyed. But now that function of basing aircraft is being taken over, apparently, by Subic Bay, and we can expect more conflict with the locals there, and more expectation that it will be used as a base for the conflict in the South China Sea. In this book, David Vine accounts for at least 800 American military bases around the world. They're called not only bases, but opposed to fort, installation, depot, station, dump, barracks, magazine, and proving ground. I was at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, which is another name for these places. The Subic Bay Naval Station is on the west side of Luzon. It's about 62 miles northwest of Manila Bay, and the area of it was about 59,000 acres. The American military facility was active there from 1903 to 1991, and it's really a huge place, but it's considered a strategic advantage to have it there. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. Comments, Karen?
Yes, a strategic advantage to the U.S. But I want to point out that not only because of the crime that a military base brings to a nation, that it also sets you up as a target.
Yeah.
If there is war, and that's a major, major concern. That is one of the reasons why I think Thailand in 1976, right after the fall of Vietnam, they closed down their bases. It was the people who were demanding it, and they did. And that was Tak Lee Air Force Base, which in more recent years became well known again as a secret torture chamber for some of the people that the U.S. was kidnapping and taking them to Thailand. I saw the Tak Lee Air Force Base when I went to Thailand in 77. Actually, I think we drove through there late 77, 78. It was pretty much overgrown. There was nothing going on because it had been closed down. So yeah, and I have predicted, my fear is that by the end of this year, it's a possibility that the U.S. might be pushing to reopen some of our military bases in Thailand. But I think their preference would not be, not the Air Force Base, but probably the naval base in Sattahip, where we do joint operations with the Thai military all the time. What I really think, though, is that it would be, if this did happen, it would be in the south as a result of the so-called Muslim separatist movement. However, given that the military dictatorship of Thailand now has moved so much closer, they've moved closer to China, they're playing both sides, make no mistake. But they gave the railroad contract, the Silk Road that I had been talking about endlessly over a year ago, they gave that to China. So, and a lot of people in Thailand have been complaining that, they're moving closer to China. So it's quite possible they won't get their military bases reopened in Thailand. But who knows? And we know that the U.S. is building military base on the island of Jeju off the coast of Korea, which is getting even closer to China. And Kathy Kelly has written about this. And here again, what happens is when they build these military bases, they go in and they pretty much move the people out. They relocate the people. And then they do this building, and in the case of Jeju, they are destroying much of the natural habitat that, and the coral, et cetera, et cetera. So then you end up becoming a target, plus you end up with people removed and dislocated, but you also have a lot of crime usually takes place on these military bases. And it's one of the means that, what happens is it's the means that some of the locals then who move in, not necessarily the current locals, it'll often be locals coming from all over, that will move in. They'll set up bars, they'll set up gambling, they'll set up whatever it takes to make a profit. And so it's only natural that no nation really wants that there, because the U.S. does not have that much, they don't have as much control over their military bases when they set them up out of the country. This is what people have to recognize. While we might have a military base down the street here, and we don't see any of these activities taking place. But when you go out of the country, it's a whole different situation. So that's, I think, my only comment on that.
Yeah, well, it does tend to raise the resentment of the local population. They typically develop a lot of hatred for America because of this. And again, what inevitably seems to grow up, the pattern is fairly constant. There will be, just outside the main gate of the base, a whole bunch of bars
Right, of
and
course.
whorehouses. And,
Yeah, that's everywhere.
yeah, yeah.
That's everywhere. Even when I set
And,
up places in China for construction workers, but the first thing is a restaurant, a couple more restaurants, and pretty soon they're setting up bars. And it's the locals who are doing this, but they're doing it because they know they've got, suddenly, they've got a market for it. So.
And it's important to note that these U.S. bases around the world, I mean, immensely numerous and incomparable, as I say, no other country has anything like it. These bases are not just static. They don't just sit there. They are, in fact, the source for activity, including Obama's worldwide assassination program around the world. The Special Forces Command, which is a very strange thing and really only developed since the Carter administration. The Special Forces Command is essentially a private army that is run by the private presidential army. This is some 80,000 American military personnel who report not to Congress, but to the National Security Council, which is the president's effective foreign policy instrument. And these 80,000 special forces are active by their own account in 3 out of 4 countries around the world. They are the people who are staffing these bases, who are using these bases for very real activities. There was an article in The Nation magazine, quite surprisingly as a matter of fact, just recently by Nick Turse, who's written about American military activities against the mythology that we have of what the American military is doing for some time. Nick Turse wrote an article for The Nation last year entitled, "The U.S. Carried Out 674 Military Operations in Africa Last Year." Did you hear about any of them? The U.S. military, Turse continues, insists publicly that its presence in Africa is negligible. But you saw the example that Ron gave. In fact, within the American command structure, Africa is regularly referred to as a battlefield. The AWARE group sponsors a reading group, which is open to people who want to participate in the discussion, considering a very interesting book right now by the editor, the Washington editor of Harper's, Andrew Coburn. The book is called Kill Chain, and it's about military operations really beginning in Vietnam and extending up to the present, where an attempt is made to produce high-tech forms of killing, hence the name, Kill Chain, high-tech forms of killing that don't risk American soldiers, American personnel, but do accomplish murder around the world, lacking any declarations of war. The Special Operation Forces are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Now, this is what these bases are for. This is what they're being used for. They're not incidental, so to speak. They're not just an economic support for the local economy. They are part of the American empire and of the American war making, which remains remains remarkably similar from administration to administration, and will undoubtedly remain much the same in the coming administration. So it seems to me that our task in some ways is to understand what the U.S. is actually doing around the world. It's not a matter of discussion. It's not a matter of debate. The U.S. is doing it regardless, whether Bush is president or Obama is president. The U.S. is doing it regardless, and it is a murderous operation that is having the effect of blowback around the world. The terrorism of which we are afraid, the terrorism of usually people with concerns about the Middle East, is a counterattack to the terrorism that has been exercised, the greater terrorism that has been exercised by the United States around the world, and particularly in the Middle East. And the structure of bases is the way in which it's done. And I think Ron is precisely right in bringing it to our attention. Most Americans simply don't know that there are 1,000 American military bases around the world, and no other country has more than 12. But occasionally we see the results of it.
Let me continue for a second. Other facilities scattered across the planet include ports and airfields, repair complexes, training areas, nuclear weapons installations, missile testing sites, arsenals, warehouses, barracks, military schools, listening and communications posts, and a growing array of drone bases. Military hospitals and prisons, rehab facilities, CIA paramilitary bases, and intelligence facilities, including former CIA black site prisons, must also be considered part of our base nation because of their military functions. Even U.S. military resorts and recreation areas in places like the Bavarian Alps and Seoul, South Korea, are bases of a kind. Worldwide, the military runs over 170 golf courses. So there's a map here. It's not big enough for you to see, I'm afraid, but this is his initial sketch of the lily pad bases across Central Africa. And it might be better to look up here. If you divide Africa into 3 parts, north to south, right across the middle here, there are dozens of these military bases. I'm sorry that's not big enough for you to see, but he can locate and account for an enormous number of them here, the lily pad sites. That each one is a possible flashpoint for more American military involvement.
I want to mention something about one African nation, and that's Djibouti. I don't say it correctly, but Djibouti, right, spelled with a D-H. They did tell the U.S. to get out of one of the Limonera, I think it was called Limonera, one of the military bases that we had to vacate because they were giving it to China. And the reason, and there was a lot of discussion about this recently online, why would they be giving it to China? Well, obviously China gave them a better deal. But one of the things that came out of that discussion was the fact that when the U.S. goes in, they will pay rent just for that base, but then they will make demands upon the government. And it's usually a military government, specifically in Africa. But they do this in the other nations, which is why I point out that you are a target when you have a U.S. military base on your premises. And in Djibouti, what they were doing was, of course, making certain requirements regarding foreign policy. As where with the Chinese, when they go in, they don't care about your human rights abuses. They don't care about your foreign policy. They don't make demands upon the government. They're in there just to do business. So they will be paying rent, probably a better rent at Camp Lemonnier for that base. But what they're doing is they're developing the infrastructure throughout at their own expense. They will make a profit based upon the business interests that come from that development. So this was what, to me, I think Eric Dreiser did a telephone, not telephone, but a radio broadcast. It was a Counterpunch radio broadcast in which he was discussing this. And I had it confirmed then from one of my friends who's rather authoritative on Chinese business practices, that yes, this is what they do. China doesn't care about your politics. They don't care about your foreign policy. And they don't make demands upon you. All they're interested in is doing business. So That was why the government of Djibouti told the U.S. they could move out because they were letting China move in. Now, this is what we see across the globe pretty much right now. This is what Pepe Escobar has been writing about the new Silk Road, about the infrastructure projects that are being developed. I'm sorry, I'm not in good talking form today, but I have a whole article here on how China is going about doing business even with those nations that we think that we can control because they're our allies. But when it comes to business interests, China is making it to their interest to do business with China. Now, I want to comment on one thing I did see on Anthony Bourdain on CNN. He does these programs where he goes around the world and talks about food and restaurants. And he did one in Okinawa. I don't watch it because I don't care about the food, but I caught the last glimpse of it, and it was about Okinawa, so I was interested. And towards the end, he was there sampling the food in one of the restaurants there, and he was talking to a couple of the young women, and something to the effect that, oh, and if they move the bases out, then you'll have, what, Chinese tourists. So what do you prefer, American GIs or Chinese tourists? And the girls giggled, and they said, well, I guess maybe the American GIs. And then he asked the proprietor of this restaurant, what his thoughts were. And of course, he said, oh, I prefer right now with a military base. He said, you know, because he's got a good business going. And he made the point that he said, I think it's the older people, but us younger people, we're not concerned with politics. And he said, I think it's the older people. Yes, it's the older people who understand what Japan was supposed to be demilitarized. It's the older people who have lived through the effects of World War II, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and know that their constitution has been abused recently with the rearming of the military in Japan by the Abe government, by the U.S. influence. So this is an issue, and this is why we have to really keep our eyes open on all of this. And one of the things that I was going to talk about today in regards to the pivot to Asia is to bring it back here, right here to Champaign, Illinois. Recently, I've had people making comments about China, and I keep thinking, am I hearing voices or what? I mean, a woman approached our table that we do at the market recently for Aware, and noticed a bumper sticker saying something about, I guess it said something about death squads. And she said, death squads in China. And I'm thinking I'm hearing things. And I said, death squads in China? And she said, yes, they have death squads all over China. And I said, I lived in China for 2 years. I never came across any death squads. And she said, oh, well, she had been there for a week, or either she or someone she knew had been there for a week or two, and it was a lot of political control. It was very controlled and whatever. And I just replied, well, the death squads that we trained in Latin America, and we have death squads, I think, across Africa now. But I thought to myself, where does some of this negativity about China coming from? And I always assume that people watch Fox News or something, which is very slanted. But then you watch CNN. I don't get too much about China these days. I know that they'll give you a little bit of truth, and they'll throw in a lot of vilification of Putin and whoever they want. So people get this nonstop from the media. But I only recently was given an article by Midge O'Brien, who's an Aware supporter as well as a member of our Prairie Greens, and she asked me for my opinion. And this is coming from Harper's, a highly reputed magazine that, as you mentioned, Andrew Cockburn is one of the editors, right? Mm-hmm. And I read it. It's called The New China Syndrome, and it's written by Barry C. Lin. Now, I'm not going to dispute any of the facts about doing business, or our corporations doing business in China. I'm sure they're accurate. I'm not sure that there are any different practices anywhere else in the world. I won't comment on that, but what I did notice was the really negative perspective that is presented by this author throughout. He covers up much of what our corporations do and the influence that they have with our government. He really is negative about China, even to the point where, and I'm going to read this last paragraph. He says, if there is any hope of reversing the sorry trend of what's happening with China sort of taking over, and he's implying that that now China owns our corporations. They're influencing our corporations. And he sees this as a very serious concern. But his ultimate goal, of course, in the last paragraph is somehow that to regain our liberty, we must first target the oligarchs in our midst. Sounds good, right? He says, in tearing down the fences to gain more absolute liberty for themselves. Oops, sorry, that's the wrong paragraph. It's they who let the wolf in. But he refers to China as terrifying. He said, and he uses these terms as Beijing, it's terrifying, the whole idea that they will be in control of business. But he also points out how dependent our corporations are upon China for our goods that are manufactured there, but also for the market. So somehow China is able to control the corporations and therefore to control us. So the demonization, and so I looked up Barry C. Lin because I wasn't familiar with him. Well, it turns out he belongs to a think tank, or he's a member of this think tank. And the head of the think tank, or the president of the think tank, is Anne-Marie Slaughter. I think, Carl, Ron, you know who Anne-Marie Slaughter is. And I thought, so...
She banned me from her Twitter feed. So. I've heard less from her recently.
Well, I know she was one, I think it was a couple years ago, she was advocating on one of the talk shows or something, advocating for a no-fly zone. I think it was over Libya at the time, all right? So it's been a couple years. Advocating for no-fly zone, and Jeremy Scahill was like, you know, he was trying to explain to people, do you know what a no-fly zone is? It's not like saying we're going to have a no-drive zone, so we're just going to set up barriers so you can't drive. He said it means going in and bombing, and you're bombing the people, you're bombing the infrastructure. And he said, and you don't even know these rebel groups who were supposedly were going to help by arming them. He said, we don't know who they are. So I found her whole view on war to be very frightening, and I was glad when she stepped down from her position with the State Department. Was it the State Department? What was her title? Yeah, yeah. But obviously she's still, I think, pulling strings. Now, my point to all of this is that people, I think, across the nation, you see, a couple of years ago, if I mentioned to anyone that I'd been living in China or working in China, people would be, you know, kind of excited. Oh, well, that's cool. Or like, what's it like there? I'm not getting that anymore. Now I'm getting this very negative perspective, or a comment like someone made the other day. Oh yeah, I visited China for a couple of weeks, and boy, I was in Beijing, and oh, it was really dirty, and the water's dirty, and just on and on. Of course, maybe it's true. It probably is true. I don't know. From what I read, yeah, they do. At certain times of the year, it's pretty bad. But I'm seeing this constantly. People making comments here in Illinois. Now, I know part of it is because we have a large Chinese population on campus, and that has been brought up many times, sometimes just a comment, but sometimes it's with a negative tone, as though, oh, well, it's because they can afford it, because they're all wealthy. And that's not true. Not all the students who are here are coming from wealthy party-affiliated families. Many of them, from what I understand also, it's their parents have saved and saved and saved for their education abroad. And since I know the Chinese, I've lived amongst the Chinese, I know that throughout Southeast Asia, I know that they will save and save. They will live in a hovel, and they won't drive a car until their children are educated, or until they have the money for their children's education. That's their first requirement. So I don't like seeing all this demonization that I'm seeing of China. Of course, one could say, well, it's much worse right now. Look at the demonization of Muslims. Look at the demonization we have of immigrants, of refugees, and of our own African American people. Yes, we're seeing this all the time. And if anybody just looks at what's happening, people, when you see this, or when you're reading something and you see a certain vilification, like what we've seen of Putin. Now, we don't see vilification of the Russian people, but we're certainly seeing it of Putin. I think it's fairly obvious that we want regime change, just as we see the vilification of Assad of Syria. Now we know Assad of Syria does not have a good reputation. He is not a good guy, but it's not our business. It's not our business. It's the Syrian people's business. So I'm just rather appalled lately that even in magazines like Harper's, and I'm not faulting Harper's for, Counterpunch does it too. They want to be unbiased. And I think they hope and rely upon our good sense to make decisions. But I'm seeing too many people being influenced too easily to propaganda.
Do the Chinese have not only death squads, but death panels and death taxes and so on?
Well, actually, we had an example of a no-fly zone being established today, and that the Russians essentially have established a no-fly zone in northern Syria after one of their planes was shot down by American ally Turkey. This is fairly serious because it has to do with the policy of the United States throughout the Mideast and the Russian response to what the U.S. is doing. It's bound up with the demonization of Russia that Karen referred to, but there have been two events, it seems to me, two important events this week that bear on it in ways that have not, I think, been very well reported in this country. The first is the shoot down of the Russian plane and the murder of its pilots, apparently, by people on the ground. And the second was a resolution passed by the UN Security Council, a resolution drafted by Russia that calls for military action against ISIL, or ISIS, against the caliphate, against the Islamic State in Syria as a matter of international law. Now, this is important because Russia's presence in Syria was already substantially more legal than America's presence. Russia was active in Syria, militarily active, at the invitation of legitimate government of Syria. The U.S. has busily been trying to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria, and therefore American military action, even if it's said to be against the Islamic State, is not legal. It's not justified by the Security Council, according to international law, nor is it a result of an invitation from a legitimate government. So this is a substantial difference that the rest of the world sees, but for the most part, we in America do not see. The matter can only become more serious because the U.S. Client, Turkey, is essentially been supporting the Islamic State by allowing material and indeed people to move across the Turkish border into Syria and to support the nefarious activities of the Islamic State. The U.S. Has, as it were, turned a blind eye to this on the grounds that these activities will redound to the discredit of the Syrian government that the U.S. busily wants to overthrow. Now, the alliances in the Mideast are obscure, as I say, I think, to most Americans, and the actual killing, who's killing whom and why, this too is not for the most part recognized. But it's possible that the matter may get much more serious than it is already, and an awful lot of people are dying there already, as a result of the American policy and the American unwillingness, in some sense, to be candid about what its policy is. Whatever you think about, how did you put it, Ron, the dangerous noises, the ominous noises coming from Putin, Putin's accounts have been straightforward and honest. He's done what he says he's going to do, and usually for the reasons that he says he's doing it. And the American accounts have not been straightforward and honest. They're not doing what they say they're doing, and they are doing things that they're not saying they're doing, and they're not also being very candid about their reasons for it. Is that fair?
Yes. Angela
Yes.
Merkel has said we have to bring Russia into the picture in order to deal with this crisis. There are a couple of different conflicts going on in the Middle East. One is a civil war within Syria, and the other is the ISIS situation, where they are fighting every established government in the area, and even well, it's not a government yet, the Taliban in
But with the covert
Afghanistan.
support of some of these governments as well.
Yeah,
This is
and,
part of the problem.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more obvious that, well, Turkey is playing both sides, and more people are saying that Saudi Arabia is also.
This is from an important article by John Pilger that appears on the Counterpunch site this week. John Pilger writes, "The only effective opponents of ISIS are accredited demons of the West: Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, and now Russia." And his point is that these organizations and states, as Ron said, 70 states and so forth, that are opposed by the United States are the only ones who are actually effectively opposing ISIS as well. The obstacle is Turkey, an ally, in quotes, and a member of NATO, which has conspired with the CIA, MI6, that is the British equivalent of CIA, and the Gulf medievalists, that's unfair to medievalists, he's referring to the Gulf Cooperation Council, Qatar, Dubai, so forth, to channel support to the Syrian rebels, including those now calling themselves ISIS. Supporting Turkey in its long-held ambition for regional dominance by overthrowing the Assad government beckons a major conventional war and the horrific dismemberment of the most ethnically diverse state in the Middle East, that's being Syria. A truce, however difficult to negotiate and achieve, is the only way out of this maze. Otherwise, the atrocities in Paris and Beirut will be repeated. Together with a truce, the leading perpetrators and overseers of violence in the Middle East, the Americans and the Europeans, must themselves de-radicalize and demonstrate a good faith to alienated Muslim communities everywhere, including those at home. There should be an immediate cessation of all shipments of war materials to Israel and recognition of the state of Palestine. The issue of Palestine is the region's most festering open wound and the oft-stated justification for the rise of Islamic extremism. Osama bin Laden made that clear. Palestine also offers hope. Give justice to the Palestinians, and you begin to change the world around them. More than 40 years ago, the Nixon-Kissinger bombing of Cambodia unleashed a torrent of suffering from which that country has never recovered. The same is true of the Blair-Bush crime in Iraq and the NATO and coalition crimes in Libya and Syria. With impeccable timing, Henry Kissinger's latest self-serving tome has just been released with its satirical title, World Order. In one fawning review, Kissinger is described as, quote, the key shaper of a world order that remains stable for a quarter of a century, close quote. Tell that to the people of Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Chile, East Timor, and all other victims of his statecraft. Only, end quotes, only when we recognize the war criminals in our midst and stop denying ourselves the truth will the blood begin to dry. And Pilger's point throughout this article is that the crimes of an earlier generation with which Kissinger is identified have never ceased, that they remain the staple of American foreign policy. And what the United States is doing in the Mideast right now is continuous with what the United States did in Southeast Asia more than a generation ago. It's only when we Americans begin to understand what our government is actually doing, which our government is very good at hiding from us, will there possibly be any sort of change in this policy, just as there was to some extent a change in the Southeast Asian policy. But the first step is giving a good account of what's actually happening, a good account of what the United States is actually doing in the Middle East, and this we do not get from the American media or from the American government. Our task here at Aware on the Air is to try to put a drop of water of information into the vat of blood that the United States has produced in the world today. Comments?
No, very well said.
Yeah, I'm not sure my fellow Americans recognize the seriousness of the situation and why the antagonism and hatred of the USA exists and why it's going to continue until we stop trying to control the world, impose our will on all of these other nations, and stop trying to control everyone. And it won't work. If you prefer a larger story about the decline and fall of empires, there are some people ready to supply that, analogies with Roman Empire, British Empire, and so on. And we can't continue expanding American tentacles all the way around the world indefinitely. There are all of these uprisings around the periphery, and we will never have enough resources, men, money, whatever, to keep everyone down all the time. And the Yale historian Paul Kennedy has written about imperial overstretch, which has happened again and again, and contributed to the decline and fall of a number of empires in the past, where they just can't keep expanding because there's always the temptation of the next territory, the next country over the horizon, and we should extend our control over that too. And apparently a perennial temptation of these people, and we see it everywhere. And what can we do to stop it? So to summarize here, the book I'm mainly referring to is David Vine, but there's an earlier book of about a decade ago called The Sorrows of Empire by Chalmers Johnson, the late Chalmers Johnson, which is very good and has a number of paragraphs and pages about the things that I've been talking about. And this book, Base Nation by David Vine, V-I-N-E, will be available at the Urbana Free Library as soon as I return it there, and I recommend looking at it.
We should make some more of these books available too at our Aware table. Aware will have a table for of information and paraphernalia of various types at the holiday market at Lincoln Square in some upcoming Saturdays. And we'll try to have some of these texts that we've been talking about tonight there, because the problem in many cases for most Americans is a remarkable dearth of information about what our country is actually doing around the world.
Unfortunately, the list price of this book is $35.
We'll try to find you a cheap copy.
Yeah, right.
Karen, do you have a concluding comment?
Only that here again, when I refer to the demonization of China, I find it so appalling that what we're doing, Xi Jinping doesn't think that we're seriously trying to foment war. So I have to give him credit for that, at least according to Pepe Escobar. But as they say, anything can happen, accidents happen. And I don't believe China will back down to our provocations. What is so sad is that the only reason we're doing this is out of greed and jealousy. We don't want to let another nation have economic control. I mean, China has not attacked anyone since 1979. How many thousands is the U.S. guilty of killing? And how many thousands, does anybody have those figures? I did have them, but I don't have them with me now. That we have attacked and killed. How many nations have we destroyed since 1979? It's mind-boggling. And yet our reasons for doing it are usually something that they have that we want. Either their resources or, in this case, hegemony, because we don't want to let someone else control their own territory. So that's all I have to say on that topic.
I've got an concluding comment here from Chris Floyd, who has written well on these topics for a long time. We'll put this too on the AWARE page, the AWARE Facebook page. We, the West, overthrew Saddam by violence, he means in Iraq. We overthrew Gaddafi in Libya by violence, with Hillary Clinton in the lead. We're trying to overthrow Assad in Syria by violence. Harsh regimes all, but far less draconian than our Saudi allies and other tyrannies around the world. What has been the result of these interventions? A hell on earth, one that grows wider and more virulent year after year. Without the American crime of aggressive war against Iraq, which by the measurements used by Western governments themselves left more than 1 million innocent people dead, there would be no ISIS, no al-Qaeda in Iraq. Without the Saudi and Western funding and arming of an amalgam of extremist Sunni groups across the Mideast, used as proxies to strike at Iran and its allies, there would be no ISIS. Let's go back further. Without the direct, extensive, and deliberate creation by the United States and its Saudi ally of a worldwide movement of armed Sunni extremists during the Carter and Reagan administrations, there would have been no war on terror and no terrorist attacks in Paris last month. Again, let's be as clear as possible. The hellish world we live in today is the result of deliberate policies and actions undertaken by the United States and its allies over the past decades. It was Washington that led and/or supported the quashing of secular political resistance across the Middle East in order to bring recalcitrant leaders like Nasser in Egypt to heel and to back corrupt and brutal dictators who had advanced the U.S. agenda of political domination and resource exploitation. The open history of the last half century is very clear in this regard. Going all the way back to the overthrow of the democratic government of Iran in 1953, the United States has deliberately and consciously pushed the most extreme sectarian groups in order to undermine a broader-based secular resistance to its domination agenda. Why bring up this ancient history when fresh blood is running in the streets of Paris and in the Middle East? Because that blood would not be running if not for this ancient history, and because the reaction to this latest reverberation of Washington's decades-long bipartisan cultivation of religious extremism will certainly be more bloodshed, more repression, and more violent intervention, which will in turn inevitably produce yet more atrocities and upheaval, as we are seeing in Paris this month. You've been watching AWARE on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 48th week of 2015. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.